Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today to discuss the listing of pre-revenue biotech companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. As those of you who follow the markets will know, the biotech industry has undergone significant growth in recent years due to factors such as population growth, global population aging, technological innovation, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. China has invested heavily in biotech, and the biotech sector is a key element of China's economic strategy. Biotech was designated as a strategic emerging industry in China's 14th five-year plan covering 2021 to 2025. In October 2025, the government released its proposal for China's 15th five-year plan, which reiterated support for promoting innovative drugs and medical devices. And so it's not unreasonable to expect continued growth in China's biotech sector. As at November 2025, there were more than 2,200 biotech companies in China, whereas a few years ago, Chinese companies generally adopted a license-in model, paying license fees to produce internationally developed products in China. Increasing numbers of Chinese companies now license their own China-made products offshore. For example, in the US and Europe, according to a Hang Seng Index's report, the size of out-licensed deals by Chinese pharmaceutical companies reached $52 billion in 2024, marking a substantial increase from less than $100 million in 2019. The capital markets are also playing a critical role in the growth of Chinese biotech and biotech generally. The main issue is that early-stage biotech companies originally faced when trying to raise funds on the Hong Kong Exchange was that given the amount of capital they have to spend on R&D, they struggle to meet the main board's financial eligibility tests. For this reason, prior to the Hong Kong Exchange's introduction of a listing regime specifically for pre-revenue biotechs in 2018, early-stage Chinese biotech companies tended to list on Nasdaq because of its lower entry criteria. Conscious that it was losing these potentially high-growth companies to Nasdaq, the Hong Kong Exchange launched a consultation in 2018 on listing rule amendments aimed at enabling biotech companies, and particularly Chinese biotech companies, to list in Hong Kong. The essence of the proposals was to allow early-stage biotech companies to list on the main board without meeting profit or revenue criteria. However, to provide appropriate investor protection, the exchange proposed additional suitability criteria requiring the products of biotech listing applicants to have reached fairly advanced stages of an internationally recognized product approval process. It also proposed a much higher market cap requirement for biotechs. This aimed to limit listed biotech companies to those that have received a considerable amount of investment from pre-IPO investors, which is indicative of their confidence in the company, its management, and future. The listing regime for biotech companies came into effect in 2018, under a new Chapter 18A to the main board listing rules. Since the introduction of this biotech listing regime, the exchange has become one of the world's largest and Asia's largest funding hubs for biotech companies. According to the exchange, by the end of September 2025, a total of 78 biotech companies had listed on the Hong Kong Exchange under Chapter 18A, collectively raising $31 billion in capital and contributing a total market cap of $183 billion. Most of these biotech companies are Chinese. Beijing, Shanghai, and the Greater Bay Area are the main hubs for China's biotech industry, and a significant number of the Chinese biotech companies listed on the exchange are headquartered in these regions. 2021 was the best year for Hong Kong biotech company listings to date, with more than 30 listings that year. 2022 was also a busy year for Hong Kong biotech listings, with more than 20 biotech companies listed on Hong Kong. The number of biotech company listings then dropped to 13 and 12 in 2023 and 2024, respectively, following a global downturn in biotech fundraising during these years. However, there was a robust recovery of biotech listings in 2025. 21 biotech companies successfully listed on the exchange in the first 11 months of 2025. A significant development was the inclusion of Chapter 18A biotech companies in the Hang Seng Composite Index in August 2020, making them eligible for southbound trading under Stock Connect. The shares of Chapter 18A issuers that are included in the Hang Seng Composite Index or have corresponding A shares listed on the Shanghai or Shenzhen stock exchanges are eligible for inclusion in Stock Connect. With the continued development of the Greater Bay Area as an innovation hub with Hong Kong as its capital raising centre, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange is well positioned to facilitate access for PRC-based firms to international capital. In May 2025, the Hong Kong SFC and Exchange jointly announced the launch of a dedicated technology enterprises channel called TEC for short, and a new confidential filing option to further streamline and facilitate the listing of biotech companies and specialist technology companies on the Hong Kong Exchange's main board under Chapter 18A and 18C, respectively. The TEC aims to offer proactive and specialized guidance to prospective biotech companies and specialist technology companies before they submit their listing applications, enhancing their understanding of the main board listing rules and the listing application requirements. At the same time, the newly available confidential filing option is designed to mitigate biotech companies and specialist tech companies' concerns regarding vulnerability due to premature disclosure of their key operational strategies, proprietary technologies, and listing plans. Under this option, biotech companies are now permitted to confidentially submit their application proofs for listing and are generally not required to comply with the application proof publication requirements under Practice Note 22. The Exchange has also recently updated its guide for new listing applicants to include a provision stating that a biotech company that meets the requirement of Chapter 18A of the listing rules will be presumed to satisfy the innovative company requirements and the external validation requirement for companies listing with weighted voting rights structures that list under Chapter 8A of the listing rules. Biotech companies wanting to list with a weighted voting rights structure must, however, comply with all other requirements of Chapter 8A of the listing rules and Chapter 2.2 of the guide, which sets out the Exchange's guidance on listed companies with weighted voting rights structures. Chapter 18A of the main board listing rules provides for the listing of biotech companies that can't meet the financial eligibility tests of Listing Rule 805. According to Chapter 2.3 of the guide, a biotech company that's able to satisfy the financial eligibility requirements under Listing Rule 805 can't list under Chapter 18A and must list under the general listing rules. Companies that list under Chapter 18A must still be able to satisfy the eligibility requirements of Chapter 8, other than those under Listing Rules 805, 805A, 805B, and 805C. These set out the financial eligibility requirements for listing, including the track record, management continuity, and ownership continuity and control requirements for listing, and the exceptions to those requirements, as well as a prohibition on listing cash companies. Applicants relying on Chapter 18A of the listing rules must also satisfy additional eligibility criteria under that chapter and Chapter 2.3 of the guide, which was last updated in August 2025. There's no listing regime on GEM for pre-revenue biotech companies. The Exchange has set up a biotech advisory panel made up of experienced market participants in the biotech industry to assist in the review of Chapter 18A listing applications. The function of the panel is advisory only, and members are consulted by the Exchange, the Listing Committee, and the SFC on an individual and as-needed basis. In order to be considered eligible and suitable for listing under Chapter 18A, the company must first meet the definition of a biotech company, which is defined in Listing Rule 18A-01 as a company primarily engaged in the R&D, application and commercialization of biotech products, processes or technologies, which are collectively referred to as biotech products. Biotech is defined as the application of science and technology to produce commercial products with a medical or other biological application. An applicant must then demonstrate that it meets the suitability criteria set out in Chapter 2.3 of the guide under eligibility and suitability for listing. The first criteria is that a listing applicant must have developed at least one core product beyond the concept stage. A core product is a biotech product that forms the basis of the listing application and, under applicable laws and regulations, must be evaluated and approved by a competent authority based on data derived from clinical trials on human subjects before being marketed and sold in the market regulated by that authority. Chapter 18A recognizes 3 authorities as competent authorities: the US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, and the China Food and Drug Administration, or CFDA, which is now known as the National Medical Products Administration, although the updated name has not yet been included in the listing rules. The exchange has the discretion to recognize other national or supranational authorities as competent authorities on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nature of the biotech product. A core product is regarded as having been developed beyond the concept stage if it has met the developmental milestones specified for the type of product set out in the guide, which I'll go through in a minute. The products referred to in the guide are drugs, which include pharmaceuticals, which are small molecule drugs and biologics, medical devices, which include diagnostic devices, and other biotech products, which are biotech products that are not drugs or medical devices. So I'll look at drugs first. Drugs, including pharmaceuticals and biologics, must meet clinical trial and regulatory milestone requirements. New drugs must have successfully completed a clinical trial categorized as Phase 1 by the FDA or an equivalent process designated by another competent authority. Clinical trials are clinical trials conducted on human subjects as required by a competent authority. Drugs based on a previously approved or biosimilar product must have completed at least 1 clinical trial. As to the regulatory milestone the product must have reached, the relevant competent authority must have no objection to the applicant commencing Phase 2 or later stage clinical trials. If clinical trials are conducted with a non-competent authority, they may be accepted by the exchange on a case-by-case basis. The factors the exchange will look at are whether the authority in question can be considered comparable to the competent authorities named in Chapter 18A and has a similar approval process and expertise in assessing the relevant biotech product. It will also consider precedents of other biotech products seeking guidance or reference from the comparable authority. If the listing applicant has completed 1 phase of combined clinical trials, for example, phases 1 and 2, this will be regarded as meeting the clinical trial requirement if the competent authority considers that this phase is standalone and equivalent to completing Phase 1. For an in-licensed or acquired core product, the exchange expects the applicant to have independently completed at least 1 clinical trial regulated by a competent authority on human subjects since the in-licensing or acquisition. The applicant will be able to satisfy the regulatory milestone requirement by disclosing in its listing document either the competent authority's regulatory assurance or material communications with the competent authority, showing that it has no objection to the listing applicant proceeding to the next phase of clinical trials and that there are no exceptions or carve-outs to its non-objection. For medical devices, which include diagnostic devices, the product must be categorized under the relevant competent authority's classification criteria as a Class 2 medical device or above, and the applicant must have completed at least 1 clinical trial for a Class 2 or above medical device. The applicant must also demonstrate that the competent authority or its authorized institution has no objection to the applicant proceeding to further clinical trials or commencing sales of the device. As is the case for drugs, the listing applicant can satisfy the regulatory milestone requirement by disclosing in its listing document the competent authority's assurance or material communications with the competent authority, showing that it does not object to the applicant starting the next phase of clinical trials and that no exceptions or carve-outs to that no objection exist. A listing applicant with a medical device that has had its registration application conditionally accepted under the NMPA's Green Path will be accepted as having met the regulatory milestone requirement if the only matters that remain outstanding are procedural and administrative matters and no impediments to the device's registration are expected. The NMPA's Green Path is a route that offers priority review and accelerated approval for selected medical device companies. To be eligible for the Green Path, the company must prove that the NMPA has not rejected any registration application for the same type or classification of device. A listing applicant will not meet the clinical trial milestone requirement if, before its listing, it becomes aware of a possible and imminent downgrade of the risk classification of the medical device to below Class 2 due to proposed or effective regulatory change. Biotech products that fall outside the drug and medical device categories are considered as other biotech products. They are assessed on a case-by-case basis with reference to the relevant facts, including whether the product has been developed beyond the concept stage by reference to the developmental milestones for drugs and medical devices that I just talked about. The exchange will also expect there to be an appropriate framework or objective indicators for investors to make an informed investment decision about the listing applicant. If the exchange decides to accept the listing application, it will need the SFC's consent under Listing Rule 204. The exchange categorizes biotech products according to their categorization by their competent authority. If a biotech product is regulated as a drug or medical device, a biotech listing applicant cannot reclassify the product as other biotech product because it's unable to meet the requirements for the relevant category. In May 2022, the exchange had to determine whether a biologic product met the core product eligibility requirements for a Chapter 18A listing. The company had carried out Phase 1 clinical trials on the product in Australia and then carried out global pivotal Phase 2 and 3 clinical trials on it in centres including the EU and PRC markets. Before completing the Australian trial, the company requested a rapid scientific advice from the European Medicines Agency and initiated an investigational new drug application with China's National Medical Products Administration. The company submitted the clinical trial designs for the Australian trial and the global pivotal Phase 2 and 3 clinical trials and presented the Australian trial clinical data to the European and Chinese competent authorities. Having reviewed the materials on the Australian trial, clinical data, and the global pivotal Phase 2 and 3 clinical trials protocol, the European and Chinese competent authorities acknowledged and accepted the Australian trial results and confirmed they had no objection to the company progressing to the next phase of clinical trials on the product. Later, both competent authorities approved the company to start the Phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. The issue for the exchange to determine was whether the product satisfied the relevant core product eligibility requirements. As I mentioned earlier, according to the guide, for a new biologic product to meet the requirement of being a core product developed beyond the concept stage, the applicant must show that it has completed Phase 1 clinical trials, which are clinical trials on human subjects categorized as Phase 1 clinical trials by the FDA, or an equivalent process regulated by another competent authority. Also, the relevant competent authority must have no objection to the applicant commencing Phase 2 or later stage clinical trials. The Australian trial was regulated by Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration and was therefore not considered a clinical trial regulated by a competent authority under Chapter 18A. However, as I mentioned previously, the exchange can accept biotech product clinical trials if they're regulated by authorities that are not Chapter 18A competent authorities. In its listing decision, the exchange took into account all relevant facts and circumstances, and since the European Medicines Agency and China's National Medical Products Administration, which are both Chapter 18A competent authorities, had reviewed and taken into account the clinical trial design and data of the Australian trial in granting their approval to start the global pivotal Phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, and that they had accepted the Australian trial results and had no objection to further clinical trials based on the Australian trial's clinical results, the exchange considered that the Australian trial met the suitability requirement. The exchange emphasized that this decision was based on the specific facts and circumstances of the case and that the conclusion related to the particular product. It commented that the decision should not be construed to mean that a clinical trial conducted in Australia will generally be accepted as a trial regulated by a competent authority, nor that the Therapeutic Goods Administration is generally accepted as a competent authority under Chapter 18A. The second factor that a Chapter 18A listing applicant has to demonstrate to be considered suitable for listing is that it must be primarily engaged in R&D for the development of its core products and must have been engaged in the R&D of its core products for at least 12 months before listing. Listing applicants can use their historical R&D expenses incurred in relation to the core product to show that they have met this requirement. In the case of a core product that is in-licensed or acquired from a third party, the applicant must be able to demonstrate independent progress in the R&D for the core product since its in-licensing or acquisition. This can be demonstrated, for example, if the product progressed from one phase of clinical trials to the next, such as from the preclinical to the clinical stage, or received regulatory approval from the competent authority to market the core product. The third suitability factor is that the listing applicant's primary reason for listing must be to raise funds for R&D to bring its core product to commercialization. This must be substantiated by reference to its historical R&D expenses and/or any post-approval R&D or other activities required by the competent authority. The listing document must include a breakdown of the IPO proceeds allocated to the core product and other products with details of the applicant's future development plans and an expected timeline for each product. In relation to a core product that's a medical device, a portion of the listing proceeds may be allocated to its commercialization, which could include building new or expanding existing manufacturing facilities, setting up sales, marketing, and medical teams, and providing relevant educational training to healthcare professionals. The listing applicant will be required to justify its allocation of the IPO proceeds with reference to the expected demand for its core product and product candidates and the utilization rate of its existing manufacturing facilities. In terms of further developing a core product, the exchange allows a portion of the listing proceeds to be allocated to its expansion and/or launch in other regulated markets and conducting further clinical trials or clinical evaluation required by the competent authority and/or the relevant authority of other regulated markets. Lastly, in the case of out-licensed or jointly developed core products, a portion of the listing proceeds may be allocated to the further development of an out-licensed or a jointly developed core product if the applicant can show that it has effective control over the R&D, manufacturing, and commercialization process. In order for an applicant to establish that it's suitable for listing, it also needs to demonstrate that it has ownership of an intellectual property in relation to its core product and must disclose in its listing document details of any patents granted or applied for and/or intellectual property in relation to its core product. For in and out licensed core products and jointly developed core products, the applicant has to show that it owns and will own all intellectual property independently developed by the applicant. An applicant engaged in R&D for a core product that is a drug must also demonstrate that it has a pipeline of potential biotech products. To be considered suitable for listing, a Chapter 18A applicant must also demonstrate that it has previously received meaningful third-party investment from at least one sophisticated investor at least 6 months before the proposed listing. That investment must also continue at the date of listing. The purpose of this requirement is to show a reasonable degree of market acceptance for the applicant's biotech product and R&D. However, the controlling shareholder or largest single shareholder of a Chapter 18A listing applicant should normally not be a sophisticated investor. In the case of a spin-off listing from a parent company, the exchange may not insist on compliance with this investment requirement, where the applicant can otherwise demonstrate a reasonable degree of acceptance for its R&D and biotech product. The exchange assesses whether an investor is a sophisticated investor on a case-by-case basis, taking into account factors such as the investor's net assets and assets under management, relevant investment experience, and knowledge and expertise in the biotech field. According to the guide, sophisticated investors generally include funds dedicated to healthcare or biotech, or funds with a division or department specifically investing in the biopharmaceutical sector. Major pharmaceutical or healthcare companies and their venture capital funds and investors, investment funds, or financial institutions with AUM of at least 1 billion Hong Kong dollars. Whether a third-party investment is meaningful is evaluated on a case-by-case basis, taking into consideration the nature, amount, stake, and timing of the investment and the investor's investment experience, background, and qualifications. The exchange provides indicative benchmarks of the investment amount that the exchange typically considers to be meaningful, which depends on the applicant's market cap. For an applicant with a market cap of 1.5 to 3 billion Hong Kong dollars, an investment amount of at least 5% of its issued share capital on listing will be considered meaningful. For an applicant with a market cap of 3 to 8 billion Hong Kong dollars, an investment amount of at least 3% of its issued share capital on listing will be regarded as meaningful, while an applicant with a market cap of above 8 billion Hong Kong dollars would need an investment amount of at least 1% of its issued share capital for it to be regarded as meaningful. Pre-revenue biotech companies should ascertain early on in the IPO application process as to whether they satisfy the suitability factors set out in Chapter 2.3 of the Guide to New Listing Applicants, which I've just talked about. Some of the suitability factors may provide significant obstacles to listing. Conventional issuers are not subject to these additional suitability criteria. In particular, conventional issuers are not subject to any requirement to have any prior third-party investment. Biotech companies wanting to list on the exchange are encouraged to leverage the tech, the new consultation channel I talked about earlier, if they have concerns about their suitability for listing. In addition to the suitability requirement, Chapter 18A listing applicants have to satisfy other eligibility requirements for listing. Chapter 18A applicants must have a minimum expected market cap of 1.5 billion Hong Kong dollars at the time of listing under Listing Rule 18A 032. In comparison, a conventional issuer is subject to a minimum expected market cap at listing of 500 million Hong Kong dollars under Listing Rule 8092. As set out in Listing Rule 18A 033, biotech companies applying for listing under Chapter 18A must have a track record of operating in their current line of business for at least 2 financial years prior to listing under substantially the same management. In comparison, issuers under the conventional listing route are generally required to have a trading record of at least 3 financial years with management continuity for at least the 3 preceding financial years. Chapter 18A listing applicants must also meet enhanced working capital requirements under Listing Rule 18A 034 to mitigate the risk that they may be unable to meet their operational expenses after listing. Applicants are required to have available sufficient working capital to cover at least 125% of the group's costs for at least 12 months from the listing document date, after taking into account the IPO proceeds. These costs should consist substantially of general administrative and operating costs, including production costs and R&D costs. The exchange expects a substantive portion of the IPO proceeds to be applied towards these costs. Capital expenditures are not required to be included in the calculation of working capital requirements for the purpose of Listing Rule 18034. However, where capital expenditure is financed out of borrowings, relevant interest and loan repayments must be included in the calculation. Biotech companies are required to include R&D costs, even if they are capitalized, in the calculation of working capital requirements for the purpose of Listing Rule 18A 034. A conventional issuer is not subject to a requirement to have working capital available to cover at least 125% of the group's costs for at least 12 months from the listing document date, and that the costs should substantially consist of specified costs. However, under Listing Rule 8.21a, all listing applicants must include a working capital statement in their listing documents. In making this statement, the applicant must be satisfied after due and careful inquiry that it and its subsidiary undertakings have available sufficient working capital for the group's present requirements, that is, for at least the next 12 months from the listing document date. In assessing a biotech applicant's suitability for listing under Chapter 18A, the exchange takes into consideration any change in the applicant's ownership in the 12 months before the listing application date. In comparison, issuers under the conventional listing route are required under Listing Rule 805 to have ownership, continuity and control for the most recent audited financial year. Chapter 18A listing applicants must comply with the general public float requirement of Listing Rule 8081, which was revised on the 4th of August 2025 to implement tiered initial public float thresholds based on the listing applicant's expected market value at the time of listing. Where the expected market value of the shares being listed is 6 billion Hong Kong dollars or less, the listing applicant will need to have a public float of at least 25% on listing. Where the expected market value at listing is above 6 billion Hong Kong dollars, but is not more than 30 billion Hong Kong dollars, the required minimum public float at listing is the higher of the percentage that would result in the expected market value of publicly held securities being 1.5 billion Hong Kong dollars at the time of listing and 15%. For listing applicants with an expected market value above 30 billion Hong Kong dollars, the minimum public float percentage required is the higher of the percentage that would result in the expected market value of the publicly held securities being 4.5 billion Hong Kong dollars at the time of listing and 10%. Listing applicants are subject to an additional initial free float requirement under Listing Rule 808A. This requires that on listing, a portion of a new listing applicant's publicly held shares must be free of restrictions on their disposal. Listing Rule 808A requires that at the time of listing, the shares that are held by the public and have no restrictions on their disposal must either represent 10% or more of the shares being listed and have an expected market value at listing of at least 50 million Hong Kong dollars, or have an expected market value at listing of at least 600 million Hong Kong dollars. Chapter 18A listing applicants must also comply with an ongoing public float requirement after listing. Following amendments to the listing rules that came into effect on the 1st of January 2026, Listing Rule 1332 requires a listed company to maintain a public float of at least 25% or any lower percentage that applied to it at listing, whether under the tiered thresholds of Listing Rule 8081 or a waiver granted by the exchange. There's also an option for listed companies to adopt an alternative ongoing public float threshold of 10% of the share class listed on the exchange, provided that those publicly held shares have a market value of at least 1 billion Hong Kong dollars. Listing Rule 824 sets out the definition of the public that applies when calculating whether the general public float requirement is satisfied. The public is defined as persons other than any core connected person of the issuer, any person whose acquisition of securities has been financed directly or indirectly by the issuer, any of its subsidiaries or a core connected person of the issuer, any person who's accustomed to take instructions from the issuer, any of its subsidiaries or a core connected person of the issuer in relation to the acquisition, disposal, voting or other disposition of the issuer's securities, and the issuer as the holder of legal or beneficial interests in its treasury shares. The rules on the ability of an applicant's existing shareholders to invest in its IPO are different for Chapter 18A biotech companies than for companies listing under the general listing rules. This is because pre-revenue biotech companies are expected to have significant ongoing funding needs to bring their core products to commercialization. The exchange recognizes this and the fact that the existing shareholders of biotech applicants may wish to continue to participate in the company's fundraisings to prevent their shareholdings being diluted. The existing shareholder conditions, which normally apply where an applicant's existing shareholders or their close associates participate as cornerstone investors or as placees in the applicant's IPO, do not apply to biotech companies listing under Chapter 18A. The guide provides that given the likely funding needs of biotech companies and the important role played by the existing shareholders in providing funding, existing shareholders are allowed to participate in a biotech company's IPO, provided that the company complies with the public float requirements of Listing Rules 8081 and 808A. That is, the general public float requirement and the initial free float requirement, which I've just talked about. An existing shareholder holding less than 10% of the applicant's shares can subscribe for shares in its IPO as either a placee or a cornerstone investor. Where the existing shareholder subscribes as a placee, the applicant and its sponsor are required to confirm that no preference was given to the shareholder in making the allocation, An existing shareholder holding 10% or more of an applicant's shares is only allowed to subscribe in the IPO as a cornerstone investor, but not as a placee. Where an existing shareholder subscribes as a cornerstone investor, the applicant and its sponsor must confirm that the only preferential treatment given to the shareholder was that of an assured entitlement at the IPO price, and that the terms of the existing shareholder's acquisition are substantially the same as those of the other cornerstone investors. Chapter 2.3 of the guide also allows an existing shareholder with a contractual anti-dilution right to exercise such right and subscribe for shares in the IPO in accordance with the requirements of Chapter 4.15 of the guide. Where IPO shares will be allocated to a biotech company's core connected persons, the applicant will need to apply for a waiver from Listing Rule 909, which prohibits the applicant's core connected persons from dealing in the shares for which listings sought. Hong Kong IPOs typically consist of a placing tranche for institutional investors and a public subscription tranche for retail investors. Practice Note 18 of the listing rules sets out procedures in relation to the allocation of shares in IPOs, covering the allocation between the placing tranche and public subscription tranche. The exchange recognizes that pre-revenue biotech companies potentially carry additional risks for retail investors. It therefore requires Chapter 18A listing applicants to present compelling reasons if they want to apply for a modification to Practice Note 18's minimum public subscription requirement. The exchange considers such requests for modifying the minimum public subscription requirement on a case-by-case basis. Turning now to listing document disclosure requirements for Chapter 18A listing applicants. The listing documents for Chapter 18A are required by Listing Rule 18A06 to include an accountant's report covering 2 financial years instead of the normal 3-year requirement. Companies applying for listing with an accountant's report covering 2 financial years need to apply for a certificate of exemption from the applicable disclosure requirements under the 3rd schedule to the company's Winding Up and Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. Pre-revenue biotech companies have to include in their listing documents the information that all listing applicants are required to include as specified in Appendix D1A to the listing rules, and must also disclose the additional information required by Listing Rule 18A04. Listing Rule 18A04 requires disclosure of the biotech company's strategic objectives and details of each of its core products, which should include a description of the core product and details of any relevant regulatory approval required and/or obtained. The listing applicant should also include in its listing document a summary of material communications with the relevant competent authority relating to its core products, unless disclosure is not allowed under the applicable laws and regulations or according to directions from the competent authority. Listing Rule 18A04 also requires disclosure of the stage of R&D reached for each core product and the requirements and likely time frame for each core product to reach commercialization. Listing documents must also include all material safety data, including any serious adverse events, and a description of the immediate market opportunity for each core product if it proceeds to commercialization, and any potential increased market opportunity in the future, including a general description of the competition in the potential market. Details of patents granted, registered and applied for must be disclosed, or an appropriate negative statement must be made, unless it can be shown that this would require the disclosure of highly sensitive commercial information. The company's material rights and obligations under applicable licensing agreements need to be disclosed for in-licensed products. For a core product that is a biologic product, disclosure of planned capacity and production-related technology details is required. Where regulatory approval has been granted for a core product, the listing document must state that there have been no material unexpected or adverse changes since the date of the regulatory approval. Any material changes must be prominently disclosed. If the applicant owns any biotech products that have been approved for commercialization by a competent authority, the applicant has to include a description of these approved products, as well as the length of the unexpired patent protection period and details of current and expected market competitors. The listing document must also include information on the biotech company's R&D experience, including operations in laboratory R&D, the expertise and experience of its key management and technical staff, and any collaborative development and research agreements. There must be disclosure of the directors and senior management's experience in the R&D, manufacturing and commercialization of biotech products, as well as any measures that the applicant has in place to retain its key management or technical staff, the arrangements in case of their departure, and the salient terms of their service agreements. Applicants must also disclose any legal claims or proceedings that may influence their R&D for any core product. Disclosure of general and specific risks is also required. For example, the potential risks in clinical trials, risks associated with the approval process for core products, and the extent to which the business depends on key individuals and the impact of the departure of key management or technical staff on the applicant's business. Biotech companies' listing documents must contain an estimate of their cash operating costs, including the costs of R&D and clinical trials incurred in the development of their core products, as well as the costs of employing their workforce, direct production costs if production is commenced, R&D, any product marketing, any non-income taxes, royalties, and other governmental charges, contingency allowances, and any other significant costs. A biotech company is required to set out the components of cash operating costs separately by category, explain the reason for any departure from the list of items to be included under cash operating costs, and discuss any material cost items that should be highlighted to investors. Listing Rule 18A04 also lists a number of other matters which should be disclosed if they are relevant and material to the biotech company's business. These include project risks arising from environmental, social, and health and safety issues, as well as compliance with host country laws, regulations, and permits, and payments made to host country governments in relation to tax, royalties, and other significant payments on a country-by-country basis. If relevant and material, a biotech company is also required to disclose its historical experience of dealing with host country laws and practices, including management of differences between national and local practice, and its historical experience of dealing with local governments and communities' concerns on the sites of its research and trials and relevant management arrangements. In addition, if an applicant has obtained an expert technical assessment, that assessment should be included in the listing document if relevant. The exchange also requires listing documents to include a prominent warning statement that the company's core products may not ultimately be successfully developed and marketed. Chapter 2.3 of the guide provides guidance for Chapter 18A applicants, which supplements the exchange's general guidance on listing document disclosure. Paragraph 11 of Chapter 2.3 provides some general drafting guidance, in particular in the light of the significant retail investor interest in biotech companies and the risks associated with investing in them, such as whether the core product can be successfully commercialized. The exchange emphasizes the importance of fair, balanced, and accurate disclosure, including clear and precise disclosure of their business models and products, and upfront disclosure of significant risk factors. It also requires listing applicants to avoid compromising scientific accuracy when disclosing its business model and products, and to provide clear and precise disclosure, not using marketing or emotional language. Where appropriate, applicants should use diagrams or flowcharts to explain complex and technical matters, and use tables to present extensive information such as clinical data, material development milestones, and IP rights. When providing views on the scientific and technical aspects of the applicant's products and product candidates, directors should avoid over-reliance on advisors and consultants, such as the industry consultant. The exchange then sets out a series of disclosure recommendations. Starting with the summary section of the listing document, the exchange requires a disclaimer stating that the applicant is listing under Chapter 18A due to its inability to meet the financial requirements of Listing Rule 805, and disclosing the risks that it may continue to incur significant R&D costs and that its core products may not be successfully developed or marketed. This should be followed by an introductory paragraph, including the applicant's year of establishment, medical focus areas, number of core products and products in the applicant's pipeline, and brief core product descriptions, including indications. The summary section should also include a pipeline chart categorized by product, followed by a concise overview of the listing applicant and its biotech products. This should describe each core product and key product, including the regulatory approvals required or obtained, clinical trial statuses with start and end dates, addressable markets, the competitive landscape, the product's competitive advantages or limitations, and, if applicable, plans to out-license the product. The overview should also cover R&D capabilities, IP property owned by the applicant, manufacturing capabilities, and commercialization strategies, as well as a summary of the key risks from the risk factors section. The applicant's valuation, including the total amount and number of pre-IPO financing rounds, must also be disclosed, as well as the identity and shareholding of the sophisticated investor, the applicant's cash burn rate, and key financial indicators and recent developments. The listing document must also include a risk factors section setting out risks in two main categories. In the first category, the applicant must disclose risks relating to its products and the markets in which it proposes to commercialize them. This must encompass the heightened risks associated with pipeline products at the preclinical development stage, together with challenges in recruiting appropriate patients for clinical trials for rare disease indications. The applicant must also disclose details of major adverse events and their actual or potential impact on the listing applicant, including matters such as IP litigation and negative publicity concerning products. Additionally, disclosure of high levels of competition in the market if the applicant's product is required. The second category concerns risks relating to the applicant's operations and the broader industry. Required disclosures include the risk of failure to develop successfully or obtain regulatory approval for pipeline products and risks associated with IP rights, including infringement, expiry, third-party challenges to in-licensed IP, and material restrictions on the development of commercialization of licensed products, including termination events. Further mandatory disclosures cover product liability exposure in respect of jointly developed products or those supplied by third parties, the acceptability of clinical trial results across different jurisdictions, and the potential for significant price reductions arising from inclusion of products within reimbursement schemes. In relation to industry overview in the listing document should include the drivers and barriers to entry in the industry and markets targeted by the applicant. It must also provide details for each intended indication of the applicant's core products and key products, including a description of the established treatment protocols for the relevant disease, with details of the clinical guideline recommendations and specifics on the safety and efficacy profiles of each treatment option. For each market the applicant aims to enter, the document must provide the size and growth rate of the addressable market, along with the disease's prevalence, incidence rate, and patient diagnostic rate. It should also specify the patient cohort for each intended application, such as third-line treatment for a particular cancer, including the disease's recurrence rate. For instance, if a core product is positioned as a third-line treatment, the applicant should disclose both the overall market for the disease and the narrower market for third-line interventions to accurately reflect the limited patient pool. In addition, the document must disclose the key quantitative and qualitative assumptions underpinning the estimated addressable market size, and the applicant's sponsors are required to review the reasonableness of these assumptions. A section on the competitive landscape is required to disclose the products and product candidates that compete or may compete with each of the applicant's core products and key products in the targeted therapeutic areas. For each of its core products and key products, the applicant must disclose details of existing or potential competitor products, including their name, approval date, or development status, route of administration, expiration dates of key IP rights, technologies, and intended applications. If commercialized, the disclosure should also cover the annual treatment cost, market share factoring in similar products launched in other jurisdictions, and pricing influences in the target market, and inclusion in reimbursement schemes with details such as the reimbursement percentage. In the history and development section of its listing document, a biotech listing applicant is required to disclose details of its achievement of key milestones, including the dates of significant development milestones relating to its core product, such as the commencement or completion of clinical trials and registrational approval. The applicant must also provide information on sophisticated investors encompassing the background of each investor, including, where applicable, its ultimate beneficial owner, as well as the assets under management or net assets, track record in the relevant biotech or healthcare industries, and investment expertise of the general partners or any ultimate beneficial owner. The section should also explain the reasons for any material changes in valuation between each round of financing by reference to key developments of products, achievement of business or product milestones, and material regulatory or policy changes that are relevant to the listing applicant. In the business section of its listing document, a biotech listing applicant has to disclose details of its business model, including whether its products or product candidates are internally developed, acquired, in-licensed or out-licensed, or a combination. For each core product and key product, the applicant must provide a description of the product, including its mechanism of action and whether the product was internally developed, in-licensed or acquired. The section should outline the timeline of regulatory milestones leading up to the commercialization of the product, such as dates of investigational new drug filing, commencement or completion of clinical trials and registration filing, along with details of additional research and development to be conducted, including whether or not such research and development is required by the relevant competent authority, and, if applicable, key differences between the primary and other targeted markets. Relevant and up-to-date preclinical or clinical data must be included, along with explanations for any delay, suspension, or premature conclusion of clinical trials. This should cover clinical trial design aspects, such as whether the trials are randomized, controlled, or double-blinded, and the risk of being asked by the competent authority to modify the clinical trial's design and the potential impact on the registration timeline. Disclosure should also cover the results of the clinical trial, including the planned and actual number of patients enrolled, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and qualitative and quantitative descriptions on the occurrence, nature, and severity of adverse events, serious adverse events, and treatment emergent adverse events, or, if none, a negative statement. The addressable market and the competitive landscape of the intended or targeted indications of the product must be detailed, along with research and development expenses attributable to the core product, broken down by development stage, together with an explanation of any material fluctuations during the track record period and expressed as a percentage of the applicant's total operating expenses, namely R&D costs, selling and marketing expenses, and admin expenses. In relation to technology platforms, the applicant should provide a brief description of the technology platform used to discover and develop product candidates and of any IP rights it owns in that platform. Material terms of in-licensing or out-licensing arrangements have to be disclosed, including the counterparty, the scope of the license, such as indications and geographical restrictions, and the development stage of the product at the time of in-licensing or out-licensing, including any adverse information on the scientific validity or safety of the product. The listing document should also disclose R&D activities that have been and will be conducted by the applicant after the in-licensing or out-licensing, encompassing actual and anticipated R&D expenses and how they'll be funded. The disclosure should also cover key rights and obligations of the applicant and the licensor, such as milestone or royalty payments and their triggering events, termination events, and ownership of IP rights, setting out the parties' respective rights to own foreground or self-developed IP, such as clinical trial results or improvements. If a product is in-licensed, the document should disclose whether any licensing payments will be made out of initial public offering proceeds. For collaborative development and research agreements, the listing document should disclose information about the collaborative partner, for example, their background, operational scale and independence, and the collaboration period and schedule. Key rights and obligations of the parties must be outlined, such as sub-licensing rights, profit and cost, sharing arrangements, and ownership of IP rights, as well as details of the joint steering committee and arrangements for combination therapies. As regards commercialization, the applicant has to describe its commercialization strategy tailored to the development stage of its products, including strategies implemented or to be implemented to achieve market acceptance and adoption, such as how to onboard doctors or become recognized under clinical guidelines. The listing document should also disclose the applicant's manufacturing capabilities, for example, in terms of building or expanding manufacturing capacities and obtaining ISO certifications, and the expected pricing and affordability of its product. The product's profitability, that is, whether the company is expected to earn a considerable return from sales of the product, should also be disclosed. Other matters required to be disclosed in the section on commercialization are the distribution model, compliance with local laws such as the 2 invoice system rules in the PRC, potential cannibalization of products with overlapping indications or similar therapeutic areas, and for commercialized products, the revenue model and a breakdown of revenue by product or service during the track record period, and information on the products sold and background of the customers. The business section should address R&D capabilities, including existing operations in R&D, and the collective expertise and experience of key management and technical staff, whether all key research and development personnel involved in the development of the core product remained employed by the applicant during the track record period, and as at the latest practicable date, and if not, the impact of their departure. IP rights disclosures must include patents granted and applied for in relation to the core product and key products, including the identity of the inventor and owner and the aspects of products protected by the patents, as well as whether a freedom to operate analysis is being conducted, including details of any soon-to-expire patents and actual breaches of IP rights and their impact on the applicant's operations, and a statement by the directors on whether it has infringed any IP rights of third parties. Environmental, social, and governance matters should be covered, including social risks associated with inappropriate use of products and the effects of product pricing on access to healthcare and internal control policies to mitigate the risks. Listing applicants must also disclose their measures to protect patient data and comply with privacy laws and regulations, and to monitor how contracted parties deal with hazardous waste materials. Finally, in the financial information section, a biotech listing applicant has to disclose any revenue generated during the track record period, broken down by core product, other products, and other services provided. The applicant also has to detail its cash burn rate, that is, how long it can maintain its operations with its existing cash balance, and the IPO proceeds, which should be based on reasonable assumptions. Disclosure is also required of when the applicant expects to raise the next round of financing after the IPO. The section should include the R&D expenses attributable to the core product and/or the underlying technology, broken down by development stage and expressed as a percentage of the applicant's total operating expenses, that is, its R&D costs, selling and marketing expenses, and admin expenses. Biotech companies listed under Chapter 18A are subject to additional and modified continuing obligations as compared with other issuers with standard listings. Biotech companies have to comply with enhanced disclosure in their financial reports. They're required by Listing Rule 18A08 to provide details of their R&D activities for the relevant period in their annual and half-yearly reports, and this should include a summary of expenditure on R&D activities, in addition to details of the key stages and an indication of the likely time frame for each core product under development to reach commercialization. Financial reports must also include a prominently disclosed warning that a core product may not ultimately be successfully developed and marketed. Some transactions entered into by a listed company may be categorized as notifiable transactions under Chapter 14. Notifiable transactions are relatively large transactions and are classified based on the size of the transaction compared to the size of the issuer. The requirements for a notifiable transaction depend on which of the classifications of notifiable transactions set out in Listing Rule 1406 the transaction falls into, such as disclosable or major. Classification is made on the basis of the 5% ratios set out in Listing Rule 1407, including assets, revenue, and profits ratios. Listing Rule 1420 provides that if any percentage ratio produces an anomalous result or is inappropriate to the company's sphere of activity, the exchange can disregard the calculation and/or substitute other relevant size indicators or industry-specific tests. The guide provides that since biotech companies listed under Chapter 18A are not required to meet the financial eligibility tests under Listing Rule 805 at the time of listing, it may not be appropriate to apply the revenue and profit ratios to transactions undertaken by these companies. The exchange may exercise its discretion under Listing Rule 1420 to disregard these two ratios for Chapter 18A listed companies and consider other appropriate indicators of size, such as industry-specific tests suggested by the issuer. Listing Rule 18A11 requires Chapter 18A issuers to be identified through the stock marker B at the end of their stock name. This enables investors to differentiate biotech companies that did not meet the financial eligibility tests on listing. Biotech companies listed under Chapter 18A are subject to additional and modified requirements relating to changes to the company and its business. Under Listing Rule 18A10, listed biotech companies require the exchange's consent for any acquisition, disposal, or other transaction or arrangement, or a series of such transactions or arrangements that would result in a fundamental change to the company's principal business activities as described in its listing document. This restriction was imposed due to concerns that pre-revenue biotech companies could become shell companies if they don't achieve their business objectives and thus potential targets for backdoor listings. The exchange noted in its consultation paper on the introduction of Chapter 18A that Listing Rule 18A10 is not aimed at restricting legitimate business development, and that it will normally give its consent if it's satisfied that the issuer in question is engaging in legitimate business expansion or diversification as part of its business strategy. Pre-revenue biotech companies listed under Chapter 18A are subject to the same delisting rules as other listed companies, except where the exchange considers that an issuer has failed to comply with its continuing obligation under Listing Rule 1324 to maintain sufficient operations and assets to warrant continued listing. In these circumstances, the exchange may either suspend dealings or cancel the listing of the issuer's shares under Listing Rule 601. Alternatively, under 18A09, it can give the issuer a period of up to 12 months rather than the 18 months generally given to other listed issuers to recomply with Listing Rule 1324. If the issuer fails to recomply within 12 months, its listing will be cancelled. Once a biotech company is listed under Chapter 18A and is able to satisfy one of the three financial eligibility tests under Listing Rule 805, the requirements of Listing Rules 18A09 to 18A11 relating to sufficiency of operations, prior exchange consent for transactions resulting in a fundamental change in the company's business, and the stock marker B cease to apply. So that brings me to the end of today's presentation. Thank you. Bye.